So
thank you all. Thanks. Hope we can give a slightly different perspective from some of the work that I've been doing and leading with colleagues in Wales over the past 10 years. That cuts across all of those, many of the themes that have been picked up by Sue, Bjorn and Sarah. I think hopefully Wales can give this interesting kind of tractable national level case study about work that certainly focuses on digital in the broadest sense, but has a specific focus on education and skills, but also that wider public policy context and particular the kind of wider economic and infrastructural imperatives that we recognise are major political and policy considerations of the time, and certainly aren't going away anytime soon. So I'm going to give you a very rapid scan across the policy landscape in Wales and kind of hopefully frame some questions for the Q&A as we go forward. Cool. Okay, so we know the kind of wider sort of societal context, these things that play a massive role in our life. There is the sort of language that we have to be quite critical about when we talk about things like the digital economy and how this can make politicians and policymakers use some quite expansive language that actually is kind of difficult to manage and to work on it in a variety of contexts. We recognise the wider impact on the very young, particularly when we see the impact of things like social media on young people's lives and the dominance and the prevalence and use of technology, and actually that sort of a much more considered evidence-based kind of critical use when we talk about things like screen time and social media and online harms, some of the sort of legislative context that's happening in the UK at the moment, but also the very old, because I think when we can think about different segments of society, we can focus very much in an education context and think about young people, the impact on digital and young people's lives. But then we can think about, you have to consider that wider digital exclusion or digital inclusion piece, and particularly an older kind of demographic too. And that's we'll start to see the kind of interesting context from Wales in a devolved nation context where you have that ability to do really interesting kind of public policy context and sort of interdisciplinary or kind of cross-governmental portfolio work because of the size of the country and because of the ability to interact with senior civil servants and politicians and policymakers. And also, when you think about kind of public service delivery, education is going to be a clear focus of some of my talk here, but also how that sits with, wider public health context and digital health and social care. And importantly for Wales, when we talk about the specific kind of cultural context and a bilingual context, the ability to meaningfully access these services through the language of your choice. So Welsh and English are the two national languages, the two legal languages of Wales. And that places a really important context for acknowledging, I suppose, the portability, the replicability of some of this work into other nations and jurisdictions across the world. And actually, there's a very interesting kind of legislative context around the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act when we look at things like Sustainable Development Goals and how that's enshrined in legislation. And there's duties on kind of named public bodies. We think about this in the context of infrastructure investments. We think about this in the context of the future economy, Industry 4.0, digital innovation, AI, automation. What does this look like in the context of a small nation like Wales, and especially in the context of post-COVID, post-Brexit economic recovery? And this is framed around things like major initiatives like city deals, kind of multi-billion-pound city deals. But actually, we are talking about huge sort of governmental intervention to address at various levels, multi-level kind of interventions to change regions and to invest in infrastructure for the betterment of kind of citizens and services and industry. But I think the kind of COVID context has really driven some of this thinking. And so Nest have done some interesting work around digital and data poverty. And that's really been kind of clear when you look at some of the kind of challenges facing various kind of socioeconomic communities, particularly post-industrial communities in Wales. And actually, that's framed some of the thinking around the major national curriculum reforms that were published in January 2020, just before a major global kind of pandemic. But I've led the major kind of science and technology curriculum reforms in Wales over the past 10 years around, a review of the ICT curriculum and thinking about cross-curricular digital competence, kind of in a bilingual sense, but also rethinking what we mean by kind of, science and technology education in the context of a national curriculum from the ages of 3 to 16. And this has been driven by huge international focus and scrutiny, kind of PISA results, and what's the aim of a national curriculum, what are the aims and the ambitions for education more generally, and actually the context of these 4 overriding purposes to the new curriculum. So when you think about kind of addressing those sort of divides, inequality and equity within the system, and trying to give young people the biggest opportunity they can for their lives, and think about actually how do you enshrine that in legislation, actually then that changes kind of policy and practice and actually has an impact on education skills, qualifications, and the wider kind of system level reforms that are ongoing and have been sort of somewhat impacted by the kind of the pandemic. And one of those things which I led in 2015 around thinking about cross-curricular digital competence. So thinking that in a very broad sense, it's not just about IT user skills, but we're talking about digital citizenship, we're talking about digital rights, and actually empowering young people to kind of, to consider like, well, what do we want them to be able to do? It's giving them agency and thinking in the context of young people's digital rights is not just about teaching them how to use office productivity software, but actually that is a big question to ask. And it's not just about teaching them how to program and teaching them how to code, even though there is a wider kind of, has been a clear focus imperative on this at the kind of UK scale and obviously in lots of other countries and jurisdictions over recent years around kind of, computer science curriculum reform. But actually then you've got this wider societal piece. When we talk about kind of addressing that digital divide, I think we can crack, because of things like we have the ability to change the curriculum and change qualifications, and we can develop teachers and change behaviors and cultures within schools and colleges. How do we address that kind of wider sort of digital inclusion piece when we are talking about addressing the digital divide? So I suppose the kind of context for Wales is interesting because, as I said, small, agile, digital nation, you've got some interesting kind of cultural context, and you have a rich sort of heritage and history. And the kind of bilingual context is really, really interesting, and the ability to do stuff at national scale with the diversity, kind of rural, urban. You've got kind of the challenging sort of the population distribution of Wales, and actually think about kind of legacy infrastructure investments and what does that look like in the next kind of 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But clearly the focus around this is we're in the midst of the most profound and significant changes to education in Wales ever, and certainly since devolution in 1999 from the UK government. But we are talking about wholesale curriculum qualifications change and what that means to be a teacher in Wales. What's the aim, the intentions of kind of education and skills and qualifications, and digital kind of cuts across all of this. We are talking in the context of, we recognise and acknowledge the importance, both in the statutory footing, but also from a cultural imperative around the importance of what does a bilingual kind of digital society and culture look like, and actually how do you foster and support that. We're addressing the, trying to think about this in the context of actually the public misunderstanding of digital technology. What's this, fake news, misinformation, disinformation? How do we create digitally confident and capable citizens, and actually recognize that this is, there's a cyber kind of e-safety perspective, but actually this is about, we want to be able to ask questions of our elected representatives and to query it when government ministers say we should ban encryption because it's inconvenient. These are the sort of things actually we do want these to be to people to have kind of public discourse around these kind of contemporary issues and how it affects and impacts on people and society and cultures and jobs and everything. And actually, so you need digitally confident, capable policymakers and politicians. So actually, why do we not push for this? Why do we not demand more for this? And actually, it's interesting. This is kind of the context of, as we have elections next week in Wales for the Senedd Cymru, for Welsh Parliament. These sort of issues are front and centre because of the importance of digital innovation for the economy and what that looks like for the future Welsh economy over the next kind of 5, 10, 15 years. And I think that where you're asking these big questions around, well, what does it mean to have the kind of digital and data infrastructure in Wales to address some of these kind of socioeconomic challenges and to address some of those, the examples that were given by Sarah and Bjorn before. And actually, we are then talking in the context of like, well, actually, what does that look like for public services? Because this is the way that people interact with government and the interaction between citizens and state. And actually, that's where you get this wider future generations piece around, well, hold on, we are talking about sustainability. We have the legislative context to be able to do this. And you have the responsibility on public bodies to think about this. And you are talking about the kind of co-creation piece. You will have to make things like, health and social care or education. You need to make it learner-centered. You need to make it patient-centered. You need to make these things citizen-centered. And actually, I think the kind of the context there is around, where is the criticality around some of these things? So it isn't just about AI is going to be this wondrous thing, or autonomous vehicles or smart cities. And actually the criticality around well, what's the potential impact of some of these tools and technologies, and how will it affect people, and what's the benefits? So the kind of citizen-centered co-creation piece is front and center with some of these kind of ongoing discussions at Wales. And finally, you know, pragmatically, we know the context from COVID, the impact it's had on education in particular, but actually what does that look like kind of going forward, this kind of new abnormal, and how will we address some of those challenges? Because these things are, you know, we've crossed the Rubicon, they're not going to go away anytime soon. So hopefully that will sow the seeds for some of our discussions going forwards. Diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you very much, and look forward to the discussions.